The G.O.A.T podcast is back. Welcome to the Club Series.
Hello and welcome back to Series 2 of the G.O.A.T podcast. And with us today we've got a fabulous guest, and I think somebody who I think throughout the football world has gained a lot of respect over the years for his reporting and covering of Everton as well. But we're delighted to have Dave Prentice on the show today, aren't we, Lacey?
Yeah, no, really looking forward to this one, mate. Not just the history of, I would say, a genuinely fascinating club, which I think even you would admit as a Liverpool fan.
Indeed.
But also a brilliant guest as well, so it's a good way to kick off our Everton episode.
Yeah. Very kind of you to give me such a big build-up. I'll try and live up to it.
Well, I think it'll be fascinating for us to have you on, really, because I know you've got your new book out, and it's fabulously titled A Grand Old Team to Report, and so I love the title, but also it's a fascinating book and a great sort of portrayal, if you like, of the past 40 odd years supporting Everton. And how delighted was you to kind of compile that together, Dave?
Very, very satisfied in the end. I mean, funnily enough, you're talking about the title. That was the last thing to come together, because I had an idea a long time ago. So many anecdotes and so many stories that you stumble across covering a football club like Everton for so long, particularly in an era which was very different to how it is now in terms of media access. And the guys I work with were all, you've got to put this in a book, you've got to put this in a book. And I actually, gathered together probably about 10,000 words worth of anecdotes, which then just sat in my inbox at work, for years and years and years. And I just thought, if I don't do something about this, so I'm never going to put them together. So I went to see the publishers at Reach and Steve Hanrahan and his guys, and they were very enthusiastic about the idea. We had a working title, Once a Blue, which was the old logo that was on Wayne Rooney's shirt when he was coming through in the early noughties. And it remained Once a Blue, for quite a few months while I was working on it, and I was never entirely happy with it, never particularly satisfied. And so I was just messing around with puns and what could we work on, and it just came to me, Grand Old Team to Report. Yes, that's it. Perfect. That was the last thing to come. And
simple but perfect, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Works,
and it took me about 6 months or so to to get the book together. I was told by the Reach guys I needed 80,000 words by July, and never having worked on a book of that scope before, I didn't commit to it entirely. I just said, well, look, I'll see what I can do, and I'll see how the first few months go. If I'm making good progress, great, we'll sign a contract and I'll commit to it. As it was, obviously the world went into lockdown in January, so I was saving myself a couple of hours worth of commute time every day. So I was able to get really stuck into it, and I had it pretty much done by June. So after that it was obviously fact checking and proofreading and stuff, but it was done in the space of 6 months. So 40 years in conception, but probably 6 months from start to finish and actually writing the thing.
And I'm sure it sort of brought back memories you'd sort of forgotten about, if you like, just sort of the prompts of going through all those sort of anecdotes there.
It did actually, it did actually. Probably since I've published it, you're thinking of other little tidbits. No, maybe I could have put that in. Maybe I could have put that in. But no, all in all, I'm pretty happy with the end product, and I'm also very, very pleased with the way it's been received. The reviews seem to be uniformly positive. Everybody that's commented upon it on social media seems to be very kind. So fingers crossed it's going to sell very well.
Yeah, I mean it's a fascinating read, and I think the bit I loved in the prologue actually was about you sort of recounting about when you take on the job as Everton reporter. And meeting up with Peter Johnson, and I thought that was just a really interesting story, really. And I think for someone like Jack, who's maybe an outsider looking into the city, I think for anyone who's reading it, even who isn't an Everton fan, I think it'll just go to show how much has changed. I think for you as a reporter as well, and sort of the access that you had to Belfield, it will have been, and you were going to the training ground, that sort of thing every single day.
Well, yeah, I never actually appreciated it at the time, but I came into journalism at a very, very privileged time. Funnily enough, my editor, Alistair McRae, editor of many, many years, retired this week, and he gave a leaving speech over Zoom, the way you do nowadays. And he's got vast experience, and he talked about how the media landscape has changed.
Yeah.
And he said that just to put things in perspective, because when I first became editor at the Daily Post in 1994, the Crosby Herald sold more copies a week than the Birmingham Post does today.
Really?
And
Wow.
that was quite staggering. It just underlined, so how big and how influential and how important newspapers were. Not they still are today, but obviously in a different format. But so certainly back then they were hugely influential. And I was very fortunate to be invited into the training ground literally on a daily basis. I would go down there to speak to the manager, and depending on who that manager was, very often you'd be invited upstairs and have a cup of tea, a bit of toast, and as a result you forge relationships with these managers that become enduring, and you get a little bit of a privileged insight into the way that they're thinking. They start to trust you more because they're seeing you every single day, and they appreciate the difference between like the local media and maybe so the national media, and so you forge these lasting relationships. Nowadays that doesn't happen because the media demands on football clubs are enormous. We're invited down the Echo once a week to a press conference where we have to take our turn with all the other media, and we do get other opportunities to speak to the manager and to speak to players, but nowhere near as regularly or as intimately as I was allowed to do so. And as a result I managed to get very, very entertaining stories like my relationship with Peter Johnson, which was a little surreal because so Peter's partner at the time was an old school friend of mine at Formby High School, which could cause one or two sort of interesting moments. So I'm totally aware of the fact that the media landscape has changed massively in the space of 1987. I started on the Daily Post, so in the space of over 30 years, and not always for the better, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean it's funny for me and Jack who've moved into it this year, and I'd imagine it's just a completely different landscape. We sort of that's all we know really, isn't it, Jack? But I think what we're going to hear today is sort of a real insight into the past, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and I think that's what perhaps excites me most about having David on today is that it's the getting to cover that such a long period, because so often when we've brought this topic up before, and we invite different guests on, we don't mind it, but certain guests will stick to their own rules of, I didn't see such and such play, or I can't judge this team, etc. So when you've got someone who's covered such a great scope of the club's history, that's like I just think it's going to be really interesting to see what choices come out today.
It's quite terrifying actually when you think back on it. I look at the number of games that Everton have played in their history, and 1975 was my first match, Easter Monday, 1975 against Coventry as a supporter. I've probably actually physically seen, I think it's something like 25-30% of the matches that clubs played, which and I'm 57, like I'm not ancient, so it's quite terrifying. So privileged in one respect, but also quite worrying in others.
Absolutely, and you've seen such a breadth, I think, of obviously the glory days, if you like it, in the 80s, and hopefully for Everton fans, the glory days, you'd imagine, with all the investment and obviously the new stadium, a world-class manager, great players, it might be on the horizon again.
I'm hoping so. I mean, Carlo Ancelotti is a magnificent selection as manager. For a long time, I was writing columns basically talking about how Everton need to be ambitious in their managerial appointments. I understand why they went for managers like Ronald Koeman and Marco Silva, very, very different in terms of experience. But really, so Everton should be appointing A-list managers, so elite level managers, managers who've achieved things and won things. And I was arguing the case for Rafa Benitez and for Jose Mourinho, neither of whom, for very different reasons, were going to be approached by Everton. But when they actually did attempt to bring in Carlo Ancelotti, I was thrilled, and I'm still thrilled that he's the Everton manager now, because he's only been there 5 minutes. He's only had effectively one transfer window to operate in, and we're already seeing tangible signs of progress. So I'm hoping that will be a very long and fruitful partnership.
And it's such a fascinating club, isn't it, Jack, in terms of just sort of the history of the club, and I think that it has such a unique place, I think, in the pantheon of the great clubs in England, really, doesn't it, in terms of obviously it's domestic prowess, two eras of football really, in semi-recent times in the 60s and 80s.
Yeah, because I mean, from a historical point of view, there aren't many more successful, bigger clubs, I would say, from a historical point of view in the country. So perhaps that's what it's going to be interesting to see the selections for these episodes, because I think it's that I would guess that we're going to get more from the 80s, the golden year period. I'm not certain of that, obviously. I mean, we'll wait and see. But and that, whereas with other clubs, I think we've had a sort of we might have a bit of a swing towards the modern era and perhaps a bit of bias towards the modern era. But I think we definitely there's far less chance of that happening with Everton for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's a unique story, a unique club, isn't it, Dave? And like we touched upon there, I think we are entering into a new era, but it's going to be fascinating to hear who you nominate first as the greatest ever Everton footballer.
To be honest, it's not really a surprise, even though we're talking presumably the club's entire history. We're not talking about players that I've only ever physically seen in the flesh, are we? Or are we?
No, it's greatest of all time.
It's a broad canvas. Well, in that case, it can only be one name. It's got to be Dixie Dean. You've got to look at the record, that guy. It's funny actually. I saw something on social media only yesterday of him when he was playing. It was a photograph of him playing for Hurst, which is a non-league team in Cheshire, which was literally his final port of call before he hung up his boots. I'm not quite sure how old he was back then, but he only played 2 matches for them just before the war broke out, Second World War. And there's an image of him, and you could tell, he's a bit jowly. He's, obviously, sort of had a long career, but he's absolutely soaring above the Hurst goalkeeper. The Hurst goalkeeper's got like his fist in the air, Peter Shilton style and Maradona, and Dixie's still even above him with his head. So he was an absolute prodigy. I mean, you look at that 60-goal season in 1927-28, and people talk about, but the offside law changed a couple of years prior to that. Football wasn't what it was then. I mean, I get really angry when people start making analogies like that, because all you can be is the best of your era. And Dixie Dean wasn't just the best of his era by, a small margin. He was the best of his era by an absolute mile. I mean, 60 league goals that season. The closest, it's absolutely ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. And the closest anybody ever got to that was a guy who was also from Birkenhead, Pongo Waring, great name, who played for Aston Villa in the late 40s, early 50s, and he scored 49 league goals. Didn't even get close to it, and it wasn't just like a one-off. So Dixie did that regularly and routinely. I think he scored 42 goals in one season, 40 odd in another season. Finished his career 349 league goals in 399 appearances, 383 goals in his Everton career. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And you listen to the commentaries of his peers and his contemporaries at the time, and I love that speech that Bill Shankly gave. Who was a big pal of Dixie's, and the speech he gave, which turned out to be almost like an obituary, because it was delivered on the afternoon that Dixie died at Goodison Park. And again, that was almost poetic, really, wasn't it? Sort of passing away at Goodison Park, sort of watching a derby match. And Bill Shankly, as he was, sort of a gifted orator, talked about Dixie belonging in the ranks of the supremely great, like Beethoven, Shakespeare and Rembrandt. To hear him like sort of spoken of sort of in those terms gives a little bit of a shiver down the spine, but it also underlines how highly he was thought of by his contemporaries. So I think you can't really look beyond him, sort of Everton's greatest footballer of all time. I don't think many even do. I think sometimes people will nod towards Alan Ball as being the second greatest, Neville Southall as maybe, sort of the greatest of the modern era. But I think everybody is absolutely uniform, that Dixie Dean is the greatest, sort of Everton player of all time, bar none.
Yeah, I mean, I had a feeling that Dixie had come up because obviously, there's the statue outside of Goodison, and the goal record is just absolutely phenomenal. The most goals in an English top flight season, and like you say, it's never even been close to equalled, really.
It's not just a statue either. There's a hotel in town that
that's right,
bears his name, the Dixie Dean Hotel, Victoria Street. So he's I mean, that's what, again, annoys me a little bit in that modern football supporters are maybe not quite as aware of his achievements as they should be. And I know people I know work at Sky. Alan Myers, who used to work at Everton, was quite angry when Harry Kane was on that ridiculous scoring run. Was it last season or the season before, when he scored in so many games in succession? And Alan Myers said to his Sky bosses, he said, well, yeah, it's not bad, but, so Dixie Dean scored in, I think it was 13 consecutive games. And the Sky bosses were like, Dixie Dean, yeah, I've heard the name. What did he do? And Alan was aghast. He said, what? So that is what we're trying to do. So we're constantly talking about him and constantly referencing his achievements, because he was an absolute, one-off and a legend whose achievements deserve to be recorded for posterity for all time.
Am I right in saying as well, gents, forgive my ignorance on this, but was his career not slightly cut short by the second outbreak of World War II as well? So it could have even been more potentially.
Yeah, it was. I mean, there were a number of issues during his career. I mean, obviously, the most amazing one was that he suffered a motorcycle accident when he was 21, not long after he signed for Everton. And he was riding a girlfriend on a pillion passenger on the North Wales roads, and he collided with a car coming the other way. Apparently pushed his girlfriend to safety, and he collided with the car and suffered a fractured skull. And you think of, so obviously that's quite, topical at the moment with sort of what's happened in the football world. But he was told at the time, so you'd be unlikely to play again. And there was a time when his life was in danger. But, literally 7 or 8 months later, he was playing again and scoring a vast number of goals with his head. So to actually recover from that and achieve what he achieved, again, just adds to his legend.
There's the old joke in Liverpool, isn't there? I think my granddad has told me about people in Liverpool used to say they must have left the metal plate in his head. Because I think the first goal he scored was with his head, wasn't it?
Well, people believed it. People did believe, that metal plate was inserted in his head, and I think it was to actually allow the bones to sort of fuse together. But people believed he must have left it in, and obviously he didn't. It's a nice tale.
Yeah. Well, he's one of Merseyside's greatest ever footballers. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And I think actually conserving the name and sort of, bringing that forward for future generations has got to be something I think that, both clubs really should embrace. And I think certainly Everton will. So yeah, I think it's you can't argue with it really, can you, as a suggestion. You touched upon, obviously, Alan Ball and Neville Southall as well in the modern era. What would be your thinking behind that in terms of, Dixie Dean obviously embodies Everton Football Club as a figure. Where do you think the likes of Alan Ball and Neville Southall come into that?
Well, Neville Southall I can talk about because I saw him, throughout his entire career, and the best footballer, Everton footballer I have seen in the flesh. Certainly between the years 1985 and 1989. For me, he was the best goalkeeper in the world. Absolutely, so no doubt whatsoever about that. Manchester United tried desperately to sign him from Everton, and Everton, quite wisely at the time, had got him signed up on a 7-year contract, almost unheard of, at the time. But he was so important. So I've seen Neville play. I know what he's capable of. Some of the finest goalkeeping performances I've ever seen, and just this absolute presence, this absolute, sort of embodiment of reassurance. So, I can speak with first-hand experience about him. Alan Ball, I only ever saw Alan Ball play towards the end of his career, when he was playing for Southampton at Goodison Park, and he came back as a Blackpool player manager, I think, in a League Cup tie. But just from what I've heard other people talk about him, Howard Kendall and Colin Harvey, I spoke to many times about him, were absolutely adamant, so he was the best player that they had seen and played with. And I've heard so many other people who saw him in his prime say exactly the same thing again. People whose opinions I respect. So I can only go on sort of flickering video images that I've seen myself. But from what other people have said, you would have to say that he is one of the greatest, and for me probably second to Dixie on the all-time list.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think, Jack? It's a phenomenal football club, Everton, isn't it? Because of the plethora of great names that obviously Dave's just reeled off there, and all these legendary figures within the English game. A lot of them plied the trade at Goodison Park, and I think that maybe younger generations maybe overlook Everton a little bit in terms of just how great a club it is, and you can see from obviously the names that Dave's listed there.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it's like obviously it's an obvious thing to say, for when you're a supporter of Everton, or you're following the club like Dave does. But it's interesting, the common denominator of all these players we've mentioned so far as potential greatest of all time is that they all were sort of catalysts for Everton winning the league. And a lot of fans from the modern era, or just focus on the Premier League era, obviously might not think of Everton as a championship winning club, but that was the case for all these eras we're talking about. Dixie Dean, Alan Ball, I think was a big part of that sort of rebirth in the late 60s. So yeah, Neville Southall as well. Couldn't agree more. Definitely the best goalkeeper, I think, in the country at that time, possibly in Europe. And yeah, it's, I suppose in some ways it has to be Dixie Dean, but equally, if it was any other club, a lot of these names would be pushing. It'd be a lot closer fought, I think, definitely.
Yeah, it's a great point that you make there. All three were winners. I mean, sometimes great footballers, can be at a football club for a long time and not achieve, anything tangible in terms of success. I'm thinking of like maybe Matthew Le Tissier, who was, so an absolutely prodigious talent at Southampton, but never ever looked like winning anything with them. Yet those three, apart from being absolutely world-class footballers in their own right, took Everton on to a different platform altogether. I mean, Dixie, led Everton to the title. He was the top goal scorer in 27-28, and then he was the captain in 1931-32 when they won the league. He captained them to the FA Cup as well, and then he also oversaw the progression of his successor, Tommy Lawton, again a great footballer, took him under his wing. Alan Ball was the same, so took Everton on from an absolutely beautiful football team in the late 60s into a team that actually could win something and won the league, at a very, very competitive era by some distance. And then Neville, the most decorated footballer in Everton's history, because he's won 2 league titles, he's won 2 FA Cups, 11 years apart. He was Footballer of the Year. And of course, he won the European Cup Winners' Cup in 1985, and like no other Everton player can have an honours list, sort of like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just phenomenal, really, isn't it, to look back on these players. And I think that obviously you look at that in the book a little bit in terms of your anecdotes there, and you've had the pleasure of meeting people over the years who sort of give these eulogies, if you like, about the likes of Dixie Dean. And what would be your favourite one, do you think, from over the years, would you say?
It's going to have to be that one, the Bill Shankly one, because it's just, it's so resonant and it's so poetic. I mean, I've heard plenty. I mean, the Matt Busby one's quite funny. When Matt Busby came down from Scotland and he saw Dixie play for the first time, and he just said, "This was my first experience of English football. This was my first sighting of Dixie Dean. Oh dear." Because he just saw, "Oh my word," so whatever got away to me, which was quite, sort of deadpan and quite entertaining. But no, for me, just that Bill Shankly speech, given as well the fact that, that the timing of it, so the afternoon, that, he had lunch with Dixie before, Dixie then went to Goodison and breathed his last. It was, he belongs in the ranks of the supremely great, like Beethoven, like Rembrandt, like Shakespeare. It's just, it's stirring, so it would have to be that one.
Yeah, phenomenal stuff. I've really enjoyed speaking about that because, obviously, like I said, it's a great club, and I think that certain figures like Dixie Dean, they are immortals really in the game, and the 60-goal season will never be equalled, I don't think, as well. And I think that will forever go down in the history book. So I think for me and Jack, that there's probably no argument from us as well, I think, Jack.
No, definitely no. I mean, it's almost third, second and third, isn't it? But fantastic choice.
So shall we move on to our next section of the show? This is a bit of a fun bit, if you like, where we pick out the greatest cult hero to ever play at Goodison Park. And I think there's a certain name that's sticking out for me, but I'm just wondering whether he's going to come into your thinking here.
It depends on how you would refer, to a cult hero. I mean, what was the definition? I mean, it's because cult hero for me is somebody that maybe wasn't, an absolutely outstanding footballer, but the fans bonded with that individual and loved him regardless. And we had plenty like that at Everton. So Davy Hickson, was talked of, so as a cult hero. My own, hero as a child was Bob Latchford by an absolute mile. Loved Bob Latchford, even though he never won anything with Everton. But cult hero for me tends to lend itself to players that maybe, aren't quite as polished or as skillful, yet the fans still take to them. People like Dennis Stracqualursi, who I absolutely loved during his time at Everton.
What is it about him, David? Because he seems to come up all the time when I've spoken to Everton fans before as sort of a cult hero figure. And I did have a sneaking suspicion if you mentioned tonight. So what was it about him in particular?
Because let's not put too fine a points on it. He was crap. He was, but he gave absolutely everything. And he exuded this joy of playing for Everton. So when he scored his first goal, headed down the park, and I can see it now, he was almost in tears afterwards. He was so thrilled that, so he'd managed to score a goal for Everton. And I was there when he signed for Everton. He signed the same day as Royston Drenthe. And Royston Drenthe had a very, very great, football CV. He played for Real Madrid. And, he was an interesting interviewee, but you got the impression that, I wouldn't say he looked down on the fact he was signing for a club like Everton, but he'd been there, he'd seen it, he'd done it, he played for the Dutch national team, he'd played for Real Madrid, and this was another move. Whereas Dennis Stracqualursi was genuinely thrilled and excited to sign for Everton, and that shone through when he played. I think he only scored about 3 goals, during his spell, but each one was just celebrated riotously, and so he loved it. To a similar degree, so Tony Hibbert, so was another one who was a bit of a cult hero, in that everybody was willing to try and score a goal, and he did ultimately, so in his testimonial match against AEK Athens, prompting the
pitch invasion.
Tony Hibbert, exactly, a pitch invasion, prompting the chance he scores when he wants. But, there are cult heroes, so everywhere, and it's a personal selection, I think, when you're choosing a cult hero. But for me, I love Dennis Stracqualursi. I just thought he embodied, so what it meant to play for Everton, and just this joy of football and this joy of scoring. So I'd like to think that so I was crap as well, but I'd like to think that if I'd ever played, so for Everton, I would have been as excited and as thrilled to it, as Dennis was when he played.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting nomination, because I think you hit upon sort of what it is to be an Everton player, and I think what sells a player to the Everton crowd. And what do you think that is? People talk about the school of science and wanting to play attacking football, but players giving everything for the shirt. Is that how you describe it?
Absolutely, it's got to be showing absolutely everything for the cause. And the reason I didn't choose Andy Gray, for example, as a cult hero is because that demeans him a little bit, because he was better than that. So Andy Gray was an absolute, I think, genuine legend, Everton legend. He was only there for 18 months, but he also had that enthusiasm, that infectious, sort of joy of playing for Everton, which rubbed off on other players. If you look at any of the goals that were scored in that era, and the first person who's over to congratulate with the goal scorer, if it wasn't Andy Gray himself, was Andy, pointing at the fella who'd scored, so getting people involved. And it was just something that was infectious and, sort of rubbed off on the players around him. So if he hadn't been such a good footballer himself, I probably could have chosen Andy as, sort of the all-time great cult hero. But no, he was better than that. So Andy for me is a genuine 24-carat Everton legend. So a little bit better than the cult hero.
Yeah, it's a nice suggestion, I think. Is there anyone who stuck out for you, Jack?
Well, I was interested to know who, because I thought Stracqualursi might come up, because I don't know, I've just always, I know Everton fans have spoken fondly about him, the conversations I've had before. And I suppose Dave's probably right that the mid '80s team was just too good, too successful for any of them perhaps to be classed as cult heroes. I don't know, but it is open up to interpretation, I guess. Another one who I thought perhaps was, he may be too good for the cult hero tag, and perhaps a bit more biased towards the modern era, but was Tim Cahill, because I mean, just from an outside point of view, I always looked at Tim Cahill and just thought, there's a player I wish played for my club, because
he was always a threat, wasn't he?
He was committed. He was always a threat. He seemed like he was another one who seemed like he celebrated every goal like it was his last. Like it was massive. And by all accounts as well, seems to be a just a guy who loves the game and just infectious about the game. So I would have perhaps thrown his name into the mix as well.
That's a great shout, actually. Yeah. Again, you could argue that maybe he's a little bit better than a Coltera, but he knew what he was good at, and he did it very, very well. And obviously the fact that he came from Millwall and was desperate to succeed, so at Premier League level, he just gave absolutely everything in every game. And of course, he always scored against Liverpool, which always helps. Well, when I say always, so certainly regularly. So as far as the modern, heroes go, he'd be right up there, absolutely.
I mean, my thinking was Big Dunk, and not to demean him as a player, but the reason I say him is similar to Tim Cahill, that for a certain point in time, whether his goal record was good in that season or not, a big game, he always seemed to get the big goal that got Everton the points in that game. And I think in the 90s, he was saying, he's a player now that I think people look back at the statistics and they only read that and they don't kind of think about what else he brought to the game. And I think he was your typical Burley, fighter really up front for Everton. I think that's what endeared him to the Evertonians, really, that fighting spirit, wasn't it, Dave?
He did, but he was a good footballer as well. He wasn't just a big burly centre forward. I mean, look at some of those goals he scored on the edge of the box against Anfield and at Old Trafford, spinning and pinging one into the top corner with his left foot. But the argument that you've said there about him scoring in the very big games is also a stick you can use to beat him with. Because, he did score, big goals in big games when it mattered. But there was an argument, and I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit here, that sometimes he could go missing, sort of for spells in a season for 4 and 5 games, when he maybe wasn't as motivated as he would be against Newcastle on the opening day of a season, or Old Trafford or Liverpool. I remember speaking to somebody once who, sort of came, and I won't embarrass him by naming him, but he came out of a dressing room and said, "Oh my God, how good was Duncan today?" I said, "Oh yeah, he was something else, wasn't he?" And then he thought about it and goes, "Although if he was like that every week, he'd be Alan Shearer, wouldn't he?" And that was it. So Shearer, modern legend, 260 Premier League goals, did it week in and week out. And Duncan maybe wasn't quite as consistent. But the caveat for that is he was absolutely battered with injuries throughout his career. So he took some brutal punishments during his career, and actually played long spells. So with injuries. I'm thinking towards the end of the 97-98 season, when his performances did as much as anybody to actually ensuring Everton stayed in the Premier League that campaign. And he played with injuries throughout a lot of that season. But yeah, he was absolutely adored by the Evertonians as a player and as a caretaker manager as well. I mean, that was a wonderful.
Yeah, he did a really good job.
Wasn't it? When he came back in, very much so. Very much so.
I mean, he brought that real spirit back to Goodison Park, and I think we all enjoy watching that as football fans, because I think the thing with Everton Football Club is that I think sometimes it's misunderstood what the passion is in that football ground. And I think it's a set of supporters, and Dave, obviously, you'll know better than me. They want to see great football. They want to see guile in a performance. And I think Big Dunk, for them 3 or 4 games that he did have, he brought that back. And I think it was important, that, for Everton.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's something you can't compromise. So you're a football fan. You want to see absolute 100% commitment. That's the bare minimum you expect to see. And then, obviously, if players can produce skill and artistry on top of that, wonderful. But bottom line is you want to see players giving their absolute all every game, and you always got the impression that so Duncan did that in the dugout, and he made sure that the players that were under his charge did that as well. So for that sort of brief period, it was a real stirring moment in what was ultimately a pretty depressing season, to be honest.
Yeah, definitely. And the shades of Duncan Ferguson, I think, now in Dominic Calvert-Lewin, the way he's heading the ball from distance and holding off the challenge, he's good on the ball as well. So I think he's probably been in his ear a little bit, I'd imagine.
Oh, definitely. I mean, he's always had this aerial ability, but I think what's changed since so Carlo and Duncan have been working with him is that he's playing like a centre forward now. He's not running the channels. He's not doing like the inside right, inside left thing. He's basically getting in and around the 6-yard box, and he's scoring one-touch goals, which is what Carlo wanted him to do, to follow the Inzaghi model. Just score one-touch goals, and he's doing it just like little scuffed shots, little tap-ins, wonderful. Like I say, my all-time hero Bob Latchford made a career out of that. And it's not something that comes easily. You've got to work at it. You've got to work about getting in front of defenders. goals, and Calvert-Lewin's doing that. And when you've got spring as well, and aerial ability, which he has, he will continue to score goals.
Yeah, so I think that rounds us off for that. So Dave's gone for Dennis Strakwilerzi as his Everton cult hero, and I think that leads us on nicely now to our best 11, doesn't it, Jack?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely looking forward to this because I get a feeling so many great teams down the years that potentially we could have a bit of a crossover of eras here, which is what we're after really. So I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, it's tough because obviously it's subjective, and I'm going to go largely, so with players that I've seen. I actually sat down with Radio Merseyside, a year or two ago. Myself and Gavin Buckland, who's a celebrated Everton historian, and we went through the greatest Everton 11 of all time, and you can't do it really because you haven't seen some of the players play from yesteryear. So players like Warney Cresswell, who got in there. Could we really put him in, even though that we didn't know that much about him? I think we did in the end. But I'm not going to fall into that trap. I'm going to go largely with players that I've seen and I've actually seen in the flesh, with one notable exception, as I'm sure you'll guess. So goalkeeper, I've already said Neville Southall. For the reasons articulated earlier. You can't sort of not have him. The greatest goalkeeper in Everton's history. You can look back at maybe Ted Sagar, who held the appearance record prior to Neville, maybe Gordon West in the 60s and 70s. But there's no real argument. I mean, Nigel Martin, was great, for a short period for a cameo, but no one comes close to Neville. So Neville is in goal, absolutely a shoo-in. Now the back four causes all manner of problems because there's so many, sort of great players. If I'm I'll probably work from the inside going out. Kevin Ratcliffe has to be in there because he's the most successful skipper in Everton's history, and he would add, sort of the pace that would go with the strength and the resilience. Now, who'd you go, sort of alongside him? Dave Watson is probably the best that I've seen, and again, in terms of longevity, in terms of as ability, but Brian LeBone, was just such an Everton legend, and won a title medal, won an FA Cup, was described as the most noble Evertonian of all time. So I'm probably going to go against my argument about players I've actually physically seen, and probably sort of dismay poor old Waggy, but so Brian LeBone I would pick alongside Kevin Ratcliffe, and of course Brian LeBone was also a skipper, as was Waggy, of course. So you've got sort of great leadership in there. So they are the two central defenders. Now the fullback roles, right back, it's got to be Gary Stevens, who was the modern sort of fullback in an era when maybe fullbacks were more defenders. So they actually lived up to that title, fullback. So their actual job was to defend, whereas Gary Stevens was such an athlete. He was able to get forward, he was able to score goals, which he did, so quite often. A very, very famous one at Anfield, off Gary Gillespie's heel down at the Cop End, which was celebrated wildly. But he was the modern archetypal fullback in that he could get forward, he could create things, great pace, great defender. Played, so many times for England, so in World Cup, competitions. So Gary Stevens, so for me. Now left back causes all manner of difficulties. Anybody old enough will always go for Ray Wilson because Ray Wilson is a World Cup winner. And he's the only one we've got. Bearing in mind that Alan Ball was playing for Blackpool, so when England won the World Cup in 1966. But Ray Wilson, so was an Everton player, and I've heard so many great things about him. But Pat Van Den Hauwe saw throughout his career, great fullback. Mick Pedrick, so was a very, very underrated fullback, but a great player as well in the 1970s. But I'm going to go up to date. I'm going to go for Leighton Baines.
That's a great shout. That
just in his prime era of 2009 through to about 2012, 13. When he was getting so regular nominations for the PFA Team of the Year. I just think there was nobody better in the country. The only reason he never won more England caps is because Ashley Cole was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal fullback. But so Leighton Baines, so it wasn't far off that level, and just that he created so many goals. So his set piece expertise was incredible. So a very, very good penalty taker, incredible set piece. So those 2 goals at West Ham basically recreated what Kevin Sheedy did against Ipswich all those years, pinged one in one corner, pinged one in the other corner. So he would probably get the final slot. So that would be me back 4. Gary Stevens, Kevin Ratcliffe, Brian LeBone and Leighton Baines. Right, I'm going to go 4-4-2 because it just means I can get, so the 4 midfielders in that I want to get in. And again, Ball, Harvey, Kendall, it's just such an incredible triumvirate. You've got to name all 3. You've got to. So Alan Ball, I've said, is arguably the second greatest player of Everton's history. So he's got to be in there. Howard Kendall and Colin Harvey, so the most, they're not underrated, so footballers in terms of, so Everton's history, but possibly they are in terms of the national team's history. They played in an era when Alf Ramsey was very, very loyal to the players that won in the World Cup. So as a result, Colin only got, I think it was 1 cap, and Howard absolutely incredibly, so was never capped. It was just like absolutely ridiculous. But so in terms of their influence on Everton and the style of football that they produced, it was just something else. So you can't not have either of those 3. So Ball, Harvey and Kendall have to be in there.
Definitely.
So that leaves space for 1 more. And so I saw all 4 of those, so 1985, 84, 85, so players play regularly week in and week out. Trevor Stephen, magnificent. Peter Reid was the PFA's Player of the Year in 1985. And again, an absolute legend. Paul Bracewell, massively understated. But for me, the one player who was as close to, what was it Neville Southall described him on as, he was as close to our Lionel Messi as you're going to guess. It was Kevin Sheedy. Kevin Sheedy was 97 goals he scored in his Everton career, scored goals. He probably created twice as many as that again. And he was just like an absolute, a maestro, a magician. And he was totally one-footed, admittedly, but so what? When your left foot's that good, you don't really need the right foot. And there's so many moments throughout his career, he did the unexpected. He scored goals from nothing. And again, he'd be arguing with Leighton Baines as to who's going to take the set pieces. And I know who's going to win. It'd be Kevin Sheedy every time, because so he was just an absolute, legend. So that's my midfield 4. Ball, Harvey and Kendall and Kevin Sheedy. And I defy anybody, to break up that quartet. So you then need 2 strikers that can benefit, so from the level of creativity and the level of, service that those 2 are going to supply. And I'm going to have to put Dixie in there, even though I never saw him play.
Got to be in there,
Exactly, the greatest player in the club's history. So how can you not select him?
Absolutely.
And if you've got, Kevin Sheedy pinging in balls from one side and Howard Kendall pinging him in from another, he's going to profit and he's going to score goals galore.
So they outdo the 60 a season, do you think?
I'd hope so. That'd be something else, but it'd be worth watching. So you then need, the player to partner him, and we're blessed. We are being blessed with great strikers and great centre forwards. I mean, the number 7 shirt is iconic at Liverpool Football Club for obvious reasons. It's iconic at Manchester United for obvious reasons. The number 6 shirt at West Ham. The number 9 shirt at Everton is because we've had so many great centre forwards. And I've referenced a couple of them earlier. Andy Gray, I mentioned Davy Hickson, Tommy Lawton, Alex Young and Joe Royle, both great footballers. Bob Latchford, my childhood idol, bringing it up to the present day. So Duncan Ferguson, and you'll see I've left one out there, and I've left him out deliberately. Because the second highest goal scorer in Everton Football Club's history, who scored 160 goals for the club, not 159, as that big banner will have you say on the side of Goodison Park.
I've seen
Well, that was because bizarrely there was a goal Everton scored in an FA Cup tie at Luton 2-2 in 1985-86, I think it was, and it went down in the Rothmans Football Yearbook as a Mal Donaghy own goal. And Sharpie could never understand why. He goes, well, I scored that goal. And you look at it on YouTube, and he quite clearly scores it. But, maybe football record books, so weren't quite as accurate, maybe, you know, so as they are then. But it went down the record books as a Maldonado own goal. And that wonderful Everton results website, looked after by Steve Johnson, has rectified that, and he's made sure that Graham Sharp gets that goal. So he scored 160 goals. 160. So Graham Sharp, and he didn't just score goals, you know, regularly, even though he did. He scored different types of goals. He scored headers, he scored tap-ins, he scored wonderful volleys. I mean, probably most Evertonians' favourite goal ever is the goal he scored at Anfield, you know, to end 14 years of not having won there. What was it John Motson screamed in the commentary? I haven't seen a goal scored quite like that in a Merseyside derby for years, and nobody had. It was wonderful. And it wasn't even the best goal Graham Sharp scored. The best goal he scored was a volley against Tottenham a couple of years earlier, down the park, and again a ridiculous volley. He scored one against Sheffield Wednesday in an FA Cup tie, just a bit like that. He scored a wonderful pirouette and, you know, sort of prod away at Ipswich, and I spoke to him about this, the greatest goal he nearly scored in an FA Cup semi-final against Sheffield Wednesday, when he dribbled from the halfway line to get within the whites of Martin Hodges' eyes and then prodded it straight at him. If he'd have scored that one, that would have been the greatest goal he'd ever scored. So Sharpie and Dixie, I don't think there's a defence in the land that could handle those two playing, you know, so next to each other. So there you go. That's my all-time Everton 11.
It evokes all the eras, that, doesn't it, Lacey? And I mean, what a team. You look at the players there. I mean, it's not bad at all.
Not a bad team, that's an understatement.
Not bad at all. I think possibly it might be the finest team that we see over the course of this series. I think just because of it's funny with Everton, the breadth of talent across the eras, and I think we've definitely got that in there, haven't we?
Yeah, I just wanted to side note as well that, I mean, I think we can't say enough how it's one of the biggest crimes to international football that Howard Kendall never got an England cap. I still can't believe that now. The only one that I would almost equals that is that John McGovern, who won 2 European Cups, never got a Scotland cap either. So I always think of those two. It's just like, how did they not get capped? It's just,
those two. Steve Bruce is the other one that people always reference. You know, so but again, you know, football, you know, so different eras, very strange times.
And any word on a manager to lead these boys out as well?
It would have to be Howard, you know, and I played that was
player manager,
because, you know, when we did the Millennium Giants just in the eve of 2000, when I was invited into the boardroom at Goodison to sit down with people like Sir Philip Carter, Bill Kenwright, fans club representatives, and Howard Kendall about who was going to be Everton's, you know, sort of player of the decade for every decade of the millennium, and then the manager of the millennium. And, you know, everybody just said, well, it's going to be Howard, isn't it? And I was trying to play devil's advocate, and I was saying, well, okay, you know, so Howard's here, so he can't speak, but can we argue the case for Harry Catterick, given the fact that he created 2 title-winning teams, very different title-winning teams. And then we argued the toss, and, you know, I played devil's advocate, but I was always going to get shouted down, and I never truly believed it myself, because, you know, because Howard is like the greatest manager in our history. He's won more than any other manager, and even though he's playing, I'd still have him as a manager as well. So there you go, player manager.
Fantastic stuff. I've really enjoyed this, and we've had so many anecdotes throughout the show as well, but it's just been fantastic, hasn't it, Jack, to sort of look back at these glory eras, really, and go through those separate sort of big hitters in those teams as well. Yeah,
no, absolutely brilliant stuff. I mean, that it says a lot about some of the names that have not been able to make that 11. That I think that just says it all for the history of Everton. It's so hard to even get close to the conversation. I think Dixie Dean is the greatest player. I don't think many are arguing with that. Certainly not many Evertonians are going to argue with that. So brilliant. Absolutely. So that rounds us off anyway. Just as a recap, so Dave Prentice's greatest Everton footballer was Dixie Dean. His greatest cult hero was Dennis Stracqualese. And his best 11, managed by player manager Howard Kendall, was Neville Southall, Gary Stevens, Kevin Ratcliffe, Brian LeBone, Leighton Baines, Alan Ball, Colin Harvey, Howard Kendall, Kevin Sheedy, Dixie Dean and Graham Sharp. So it's not a bad 11 there. And you wouldn't fancy your chances up against them.
So yeah, that rounds us up for today. I've really enjoyed this one, Jack.
Yeah, no, absolutely brilliant, mate. Thank you so much, David, for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And I mean, I would say I'd encourage every Everton fan to go and immediately order a grand old team to report. But I think they've probably already done that in the months previous. So, but yeah, I'm sure if they haven't, they will now.
Oh, I appreciate that sentiment. Thank you, guys. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for coming on. And yeah, like Jack says, go and pick up a copy because it's a fascinating read. Anyway, from us two and Dave, that's just about it for today. Check us out on Apple Podcasts. Hopefully leave us a 5-star review. And any feedback will be welcomed as well up on our Twitter profile. That's at @GOAT_podcast_. But from me, it's goodbye.
And from me, it's goodbye as well.